two navies, one narrow strait, and a pattern Japan's own Ministry of Defense says it has tracked for years now. Russian and Chinese warships just carried out a joint patrol through waters near Japan, and according to Japan's Ministry of Defense, this wasn't an isolated event. It's the latest entry in a running record of combined Russia-China naval activity that Tokyo has been documenting and publicly disclosing for several years. That word latest is the whole story here. A single warship passing through international waters isn't remarkable. A recurring joint patrol, tracked and logged by a government's defense ministry over multiple years, is something else entirely. It's a pattern, and naval intelligence reads patterns very differently than one-off incidents. Here's what this video is going to do. We'll lay out what Japan's Ministry of Defense has actually confirmed about this patrol, its reported route, its composition, how it was monitored. We'll separate that confirmed information from what's still unverified or beyond the public record, because that distinction matters and we're not going to blur it just to tell a better story. And we'll explain, using assessments from security analysts who study this relationship, why Tokyo treats these joint transits as a strategic signal rather than routine seamanship. Let's start with what a joint patrol actually means here, because the term gets thrown around loosely. This isn't a combined amphibious assault. It isn't a joint task force under unified command the way NATO allies operate together. Based on how Japan's Ministry of Defense has described these events over the past several years, a Russia-China joint patrol typically involves a small number of surface combatants from each navy, destroyers or frigates, sometimes with support vessels, sailing together or in close coordination along a route that passes through or near Japanese waters and nearby international straits. The key word is coordination. These aren't two separate national patrols that happen to cross paths. Japan's defense ministry has specifically called these transits combined activity, and that's a higher bar. It implies shared planning, synchronized timing, and a level of interoperability between two navies that, 20 years ago, almost never operated together. The Tsugaru Strait, which separates Japan's main island of Honshu from Hokkaido to the north, is worth explaining because it comes up constantly in these stories and most viewers have never had it defined for them. It's legally classified as an international strait, meaning foreign warships, including Russian and Chinese vessels, have the right of transit passage through it under the law of the sea, same as commercial shipping. Japan can't legally block a Russian or Chinese warship from passing through Tsugaru as long as it's engaged in continuous transit. That legal reality is part of why these patrols keep happening in a way that's fully lawful, even as Tokyo treats them as strategically significant. Here's a real obstacle in reporting a story like this honestly, separating what's confirmed from what merely sounds plausible. Japan's Ministry of Defense, through its Joint Staff Office, does release information on foreign naval and air movements near Japan, but those releases tend to be terse. A statement might confirm that a certain number of vessels were tracked, their general class, and their approximate route, without naming individual hull numbers or commanding officers. When a story like this circulates, there's a strong pull to fill in those gaps with details that sound specific but were never confirmed by anyone. We're not doing that here. Where the public record is thin, we'll say so instead of inventing detail to make the video feel more complete. I went through several years of the Joint Staff Office's releases on Russia-China combined activity to understand the baseline pattern before looking at this specific patrol, and one thing stood out fast. The frequency hasn't been static. It's been reported more often since the early 2020s, and the ministry's own materials have started calling it a trend rather than a string of unconnected incidents. That's Tokyo's word choice, not ours, and it matters. So what do we actually know about the route and makeup of this specific patrol? According to Japan's Ministry of Defense, the joint force sailed through waters near Japan as part of the broader pattern of combined Russia-China naval activity the ministry has tracked in recent years. Japan's self-defense forces, the Maritime Self-Defense Force and the Air Self-Defense Force, monitored the transit with surface vessels and patrol aircraft, which is standard protocol whenever a foreign naval force like this is detected approaching or crossing Japanese waters. That monitoring process is worth explaining as background, separate from this one patrol's specifics. When the Joint Staff Office detects a foreign warship formation approaching, standard practice is to send Maritime Self-Defense Force destroyers to visually track and, where useful, photograph the vessels, while P-1 or P-3C patrol aircraft fly aerial surveillance to confirm vessel types and headings. This isn't aggressive or escalatory on Japan's part. It's a routine sovereignty and situational awareness function that most coastal states with functioning navies carry out when foreign warships operate near their territory. NATO members do the same with Russian vessels crossing the English Channel or the Baltic approaches. For a while, outside observers treated each of these joint transits as a one-day headline, gone by the next news cycle. That looks like a mistake now. Line up Japan's own disclosures side by side, year by year, and what emerges isn't a series of coincidences. It's a rhythm, and rhythms are exactly what defense planners build assessments around. So why doesn't Japan treat this as routine, even though the transit itself, legally, is? Start with geography. Japan sits along some of the most consequential maritime choke points in the Indo-Pacific. Tsugaru, the Soya Strait to the north, the Osumi Strait to the south. A Russian or Chinese naval formation moving through one of these straits, especially when the two navies are operating together, gives Moscow and Beijing direct, close to real-time visibility into how Japan detects, tracks, and responds to foreign military activity near its coast. Analysts who study Japan's defense posture have noted that repeated transits like this function, whether or not that's the stated purpose, as a form of familiarization. Both navies get practical experience operating in Japanese-monitored waters, and Japan's response patterns become better known to them with each repeat. Second, what it signals about the Moscow-Beijing military relationship more broadly. For most of the post-Cold War period, Russian and Chinese naval cooperation was limited and sporadic. That's changed over the past several years. Japan's Ministry of Defense has explicitly tied these joint patrols to a wider pattern of deepening military cooperation between Russia and China, alongside joint air patrols by Russian and Chinese bombers near Japanese and South Korean airspace, and joint naval exercises run under names like the Joint Sea Series. Security analysts, including researchers at Japanese and Western defense institutes, generally read the naval patrols as one visible strand of a broader strategic alignment, driven less by a formal alliance, which neither Moscow nor Beijing has pursued, and more by a shared interest in showing coordinated capability to Washington, Tokyo, and Seoul at once. It's worth being precise about the limits of that assessment, because this is exactly where sourcing discipline matters. Analysts describe this as evidence of deepening military coordination. That's an assessment, not a confirmed fact about intent. Nobody outside the Russian and Chinese governments can say with certainty why a particular patrol was scheduled when it was, or what internal military planning produced it. What's confirmed is the pattern of activity itself, documented by Japan's own ministry. What's assessed by outside analysts is what that pattern means strategically. We're keeping those two categories separate on purpose. Here's what strikes me about this story, stepping back from any single transit. It isn't really the ships, it's the paper trail. Japan has chosen, deliberately, to make this pattern visible, publishing tracking data, vessel counts, and routes for years, when it could just as easily treat this as a low-key sovereignty matter it handles quietly. Publicizing it is itself a form of signaling, aimed less at Moscow and Beijing than at Japan's own public and its allies. This is happening, repeatedly, and we want you to see the pattern too. Understanding why Japan monitors this closely is one thing. What Japan actually does in response is a separate question, and it's where a common assumption falls apart. Most people assume that when Japan's self-defense forces scramble ships and aircraft to track a Russian-Chinese formation, it's basically an intercept, a tense, adversarial encounter. In the vast majority of documented cases, it isn't. The standard posture is passive shadowing. Japanese vessels and aircraft observe, photograph, and log the foreign formation's movements from a safe distance without radio challenges, warning shots, or close maneuvering. Unless the foreign vessels enter Japanese territorial waters without authorization or breach the rules of innocent or transit passage. Going back years, across the overwhelming majority of these joint patrol cases, Japan's Ministry of Defense hasn't reported any such breach. The ships were tracked. They transited. They left. That's a less dramatic answer than a lot of coverage implies, but it's the honest one. Here's what doesn't add up on the surface. If these transits are legal and the response is routine, why does Japan keep escalating the public attention it gives them? Analysts point to cumulative significance. It isn't any single transit that matters. Japan's defense white papers in recent years have shifted from describing Russia-China joint activity as a notable development to calling it a defining feature of the regional security environment. That shift in institutional language, more than any individual patrol, is the real story of how Tokyo's threat assessment has evolved. Here's the take that'll probably draw pushback. Treating every one of these joint patrols as a fresh, individually alarming headline actually undersells what's going on. When each transit gets covered as an isolated Russia and China ships spotted near Japan story, it resets the clock. Audiences respond to it as news, forget it, then respond fresh to the next one, never connecting the years-long trend line Japan's own ministry has been documenting. The pattern matters more than any single instance of it, and covering this as a recurring wire service story instead of a multi-year trend is, honestly, a failure of framing by a lot of coverage, including, at times, ours. What do you think? Does the steady drumbeat of these joint patrols represent a genuine, deepening military partnership between Moscow and Beijing? Or is it more a series of coordinated but limited signals, each designed to be noticed without committing either side to much? That's a real, open question among people who study this relationship for a living, and there isn't a settled answer. There's a line that shows up a lot in analyst commentary on this relationship that's worth sitting with. The two navies don't need a formal alliance to make this signal work. They just need to keep showing up together on a schedule regular enough that everyone watching starts to expect it. That, more than any single transit, is what should worry, or at least interest, anyone tracking the region. Because the next joint patrol isn't really a new story. It's confirmation of the same one. So where does this actually stand right now? Confirmed, Japan's Ministry of Defense has publicly reported this joint Russia-China naval patrol sailing through waters near Japan, consistent with a pattern of similar combined activity it has documented over recent years. Confirmed, Japan's self-defense forces monitored the transit using standard surface and aerial tracking procedures. Confirmed, Japanese officials and outside defense analysts have described the broader trend of these patrols as evidence of deepening Russia-China military coordination in the Indo-Pacific. Unconfirmed, or beyond what's public, the specific internal planning or command arrangements between the Russian and Chinese navies for this transit. Any classified assessment either government holds about its purpose and precise operational details, exact vessel identities, real-time positions, communications between the two forces, that neither Moscow, Beijing, nor Tokyo has put in the public record. If you see a version of this story citing hull numbers, named commanders, or a stated joint objective for this specific transit, treat it skeptically unless it's sourced to an official release, because that level of detail generally isn't what these disclosures contain. We're leaving one thing out on purpose. The full multi-year timeline of every previous joint Russia-China patrol Japan has documented, transit by transit, would make this video much longer, and we didn't want to pad it with a data dump. If you want that full year-by-year timeline as a follow-up video, comment timeline and let us know. What genuinely isn't known yet, and probably won't be for a while, is how far this coordination extends beyond visible patrols. Whether it involves deeper intelligence sharing, shared targeting data, joint planning against a specific contingency, or whether it stays, as some analysts argue, a lower-cost signaling exercise that looks more integrated from the outside than it actually is on the inside. That's the real open question hanging over every one of these stories, and neither side has been transparent enough, publicly, for outside observers to close it. If you want to verify any of this yourself rather than take a video's word for it, Japan's Ministry of Defense publishes its Joint Staff Office press releases on foreign military movements directly, and outlets like USNI News and Naval News regularly translate and contextualize those releases for English-language readers. That's where a story like this actually starts. Not with a headline, but with a one-page government disclosure most people never click through to read.